Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded event for GCE Design and Technology, Product Design, Graphics. Feedback on the June 2015 Unit 2 exam. To help you get the most out of this feedback, you may want to have the following documents handy, as they will be referred to during the session. The question paper. The feedback event will consider some of the subparts of questions. Only examples of candidate responses will be shown. Therefore, the question paper will be a valuable document to use to see the questions in full and in context, including any diagrams. The mark scheme. As with the question paper, the mark scheme will be a useful document when we look at candidate responses, and also during the event, when you will be marking some examples of candidate work. The Principal Examiner's Report. The report goes into more detail with regards to the typical responses made by candidates for all questions on the examination paper. This document should be used in conjunction with the slides for this training session to paint an overall picture of candidate performance across the whole of the paper. Finally, the GCE specification is a useful reference to have to hand where the feedback or the examiner's report comments on the processes and materials which are listed in the content. The purpose of this session is so that you can be given generalised feedback on the June 2015 paper. We will be looking at the overall performance of candidates on the paper as a whole. The performance of the paper was broadly comparable to summer 2014, with candidates showing a similar ability profile to those in previous years. The main part of the session will consider typical types of question which occur often in the GCE AS Graphics paper. For these question types, examples of responses from candidates who scored highly will be discussed first. Then, lower scoring responses from other candidates will be looked at. Reasons for the difference in achievement will also be considered and key points noted. Finally, there will be opportunity to consider extracts from the examiner's report where this is pertinent to the question or concept being explained. One common feature of the AS Graphics paper is a question which examines the candidate's ability to produce drawings in a range of different formats. To make sure that candidates are fully prepared to answer this question, they should be familiar with the drawing techniques listed in section 2.4.2 of the specification, page 98, and be able to perform the two transformation processes given. This year, the purpose of this question, 5A, was to examine the candidate's ability to interpret the net of a package and from that net produce a two-point perspective drawing. The majority of responses showed a good understanding of the two-point perspective technique. Candidates were able to visualize the net as a 3D product and communicate the packaging features in the drawing. A high proportion of candidates responded in a similar way to the one shown, with their construction showing the horizon line, vanishing points, and lines of perspective clearly. The question asked candidates to construct a two-point perspective drawing. Therefore, evidence of these features was needed in order to gain full marks. Candidates should be encouraged to use thick and thin lines appropriately when answering this style of question, as they highlight to the examiner the main features of the answer. As with the previous example, this candidate has gained full marks. These marks have been achieved by the candidate including each of the following features in their response for 1 mark each. Their two-point perspective drawing showing construction details in the form of a horizon line, vanishing points, and lines of perspective. Correct shape and proportion of the base of the packaging, which was an approximate cuboid based on the perspective used for the drawing. The pyramid top shown clearly and well defined. The windows are drawn in the correct location and in the correct orientation. The windows are also the correct shape and size, and the drawing indicates that there is an overlap between the windows. Whilst the majority of candidates presented an answer to the question which had been asked for, a significant minority lost marks due to either not fully understanding what a two-point perspective drawing was, or they did not read the question fully. candidates who failed to construct a 2-point perspective drawing were able to achieve up to 2 marks for this question. In this case, the candidate has drawn an approximate axonometric drawing. However, they have shown the base of the packaging to be an approximate cuboid for 1 mark, and the windows are the correct shape and orientation. This achieves the 2nd mark. No further marks can be awarded as the response is not a 2-point perspective drawing. As previously stated, candidates should have a good knowledge of each of the presentation techniques listed in the specification and should read questions fully in order to make sure that they know exactly what is being examined. The majority of candidates tend to perform well in the sketching and presentation questions, which is to be expected in a GCE qualification in graphics. A large proportion of candidates were able to correctly interpret the drawing of the net which they had been given, and were able to present this as a 2-point perspective drawing. As previously identified, the majority of candidates had a good understanding of how to construct a 2-point perspective drawing, and included appropriate construction details in their responses. Those candidates who did well on this question were those who demonstrated good graphical communication skills. In sketching questions, these skills include making sure that the response is drawn to an appropriate size, as this allows the examiner to identify the features which are being looked for. The use of thick and thin lines should also be encouraged, as these allow the examiner to differentiate between construction lines and outlines. Question 3A was an explain question, and therefore required candidates to make 1 valid point with a relevant and related explanation. In this question, it was not sufficient to write single-word answers or a collection of unrelated points. Such an approach would gain 1 mark as a maximum. The question focused on the reasons for using styrofoam for prototype block models rather than comparing styrofoam to other materials. Responses which related to general properties of styrofoam, such as it is lightweight, attracted no marks. Most candidates did, however, score well, with most of the points in the mark scheme being covered by candidates. Shown here is an example of a candidate response which includes 1 key point, very easy to shape, and links this to can be shaped using normal hand tools, for which they were awarded the marks. Furthermore, they have also commented upon the material being relatively inexpensive and allows designers to test ideas. These 2 points are also linked in the mark scheme in the 3rd bullet point, therefore marks could also have been awarded here. This question was particularly well answered by a high proportion of candidates. This was most likely due to the familiarity with the material and that they will have had first-hand experience of using it in their own prototyping and modelling work. This is an example of a response from a learner who not only gained both marks for the question, but also demonstrated good examination techniques. As an explain type question, an examiner would be looking for a link between a property of the material and an extension to the point made. Here, the candidate has identified a property of styrofoam, that it is easy to cut. They have then expanded on this in the remainder of the answer by explaining that it would be easy to create the shape of the fragrance bottle using hand tools. Since the original point has been expanded, with the candidate linking the property of the material to its ability to be worked with hand tools, both marks have been awarded. In order to gain full marks for an explain type question, candidates must either expand on an initial point, as is the case here, or justify a given point with a reason. This response, however, has only been awarded 1 mark. If the response is considered alongside the first bullet point from the mark scheme, the candidate has effectively repeated the identification but has not expanded on this. They have stated that it is easy to work and easy to mould shape, which is a repetition of the same marking point. Even if this question had more marks available, this response would still have been limited to 1 mark. This is a response typical of the lower achieving candidates who tended to treat questions such as this as state rather than explain questions. Here, the candidate has given one reason why styrofoam is used, but they have failed to explain the reason why. As previously considered, in order to gain full marks for an explain type question, candidates must either expand upon an initial point with a reason or with a justification. Those candidates who performed well in question 3A were those who were able to identify relevant properties of styrofoam when considering the application of the material for a small block model. Many of the candidates were able to identify specific properties of styrofoam, which made it suitable for making a block model, such as it being easy to work, being able to achieve a high-quality finish, or it being a material which allows models to be made quickly. Although the majority of candidates performed well, some candidates showed only a limited understanding of the link between properties and applications, which restricted their achievement. Such responses could have been improved by adding linked justifications when answering this type of explain question. Section 231F of the AS specification includes a number of modern materials and products which candidates should be taught about. Their knowledge should enable them to answer questions which consider the applications of these materials. In question 1C, the focus is on phosphorescent pigments and how they can be used to enhance safety signage. The question is in the form of a describe question, and candidates are asked to describe how phosphorescent pigments can be used to enhance safety signage. The form of response expected would be a series of points or statements which consider both the properties of the pigment and the application of the pigment. There is no requirement in a describe question for points to be justified. However, their answer should be presented coherently and logically. Look at the example candidate's response above. Using the mark scheme for question 1C, decide what mark you think should be awarded and why. If you wish, you may pause the video to carry out this activity. This answer is a typical response from a mid-achieving candidate. As a describe question, to gain all of the marks available, a candidate would need to identify 3 key points in order to get the 3 available marks, ideally linking these to the context in the question. In this response, the candidate has stated that pigments absorb light during the daytime. This is awarded 1 mark against the second marking point in the mark scheme. A second mark is then awarded to the candidate for once it becomes darker, the phosphorescent pigments slowly release the energy as light. This is awarded against the third marking point in the mark scheme. No further marks are awarded, as reference to the energy being stored is a repeat of bullet point 2, nor is there a link to the application of the pigments in safety signage, which would be expected to gain the third mark. As stated previously, this particular question considered both the properties of the phosphorescent pigments as a modern material and also a typical application of the material. In this question, successful candidates not only had a good knowledge of the properties of phosphorescent pigments, such as the ability of them to absorb light energy during the daytime and to release the energy again when the light level drops, they also used technical language appropriately. The higher achieving candidates were also able to link the properties of phosphorescent pigments to their use in safety signage, considering factors such as the pigments allow the sign to glow in the dark. Higher level responses also considered the specific requirements of the safety signage when in use, such as being able to be seen during a power cut, or when the light level is low, as could be the case during a fire. The less successful candidates tended to respond with more generic answers, which possibly only considered that phosphorescent pigments would allow the sign to glow in the dark. The answers often showed only limited knowledge of the properties of phosphorescent pigments, rarely noting that the pigments absorb light during the daytime, which is then released when it is dark. Generic terminology would also feature in these types of response, with terms such as light rather than energy being used. The key difference between the higher and lower achieving candidates, however, was the lack of a link between the properties of phosphorescent pigment and its application in safety signage. Commonly, they would either describe how the pigments function or how the signage was enhanced. Many lower scoring candidates repeated the question in their answer. Some lower achieving candidates also held misconceptions about the requirements of the product. For example, considering the sign would be heat resistant as a result of the pigments, or errors concerning the properties of phosphorescent pigments, for example, that they reflect light. In describe questions, answers can be a series of points. However, these should be related and linked to the focus of the question. A series of points which have only a tenuous link to the question context will rarely achieve full marks. Moving on to question 5C. This is a further example of an explain question, and therefore required candidates to provide two valid points with a related justification or expansion of the point. The question focuses on the unsuitability of screen printing for the production of a large batch of packaging, and although comparisons with other forms of printing were not asked for, where a disadvantage was given, which makes a valid comparison with a different process, credit was given. As the focus is on the disadvantages of the screen printing, it was appropriate for candidates to include scale of production, efficiency and costs in their answers. This particular question allowed candidates of all ability levels to achieve some marks, ranging from full marks through to 1 mark. This particular form of question is common throughout the AS paper. Therefore, candidates have a familiarity with the need to not simply produce a list of points when the command word explain is used. As screen printing is one of the few printing processes which candidates may have first-hand experience of using in centres, a good level of knowledge was exhibited about the processes and limitations. The higher achieving candidates, however, were able to link this back to the photographic images on the packaging. This particular response represents the key points which most candidates considered, along with appropriate extensions. A common response was the process takes a long time. In this example, this is expanded upon by stating this is due to the ink taking a long time to dry. As these points are related, 2 marks can be awarded. The candidate also identifies that there could be a blurred image, which leads to packaging being different. Again, the points are linked and both marks awardable. Provided candidates justify their statements appropriately, credit is given even if the identification and justification are contained within different marking points in the mark scheme. The lower achieving candidates presented responses which were similar to the example shown. There are 2 valid points identified, namely, the process is time-consuming and that screen printing does not pick up little details. Neither of these statements are explained, hence no further marks are awardable. The candidate has continued to state that it wouldn't be a high-quality print. However, this would have been a third identification rather than a justification and attracts no marks. As a result, this candidate has only achieved 2 of the 4 marks available, as they have not provided a relevant and related explanation for each of the 2 reasons given. It is not sufficient to write single-word answers or a collection of unrelated points. Each valid point without expansion will only gain 1 mark. In this particular example, the candidate has provided 1 justified reason. The ink used in screen printing also takes a long time to dry, which makes it time-consuming for large batches of products, which attracts 2 marks. However, because they have provided 2 further points without any expansions, only 1 additional mark is awardable. While this question was generally well answered, some candidates, such as in this example, lost marks by not explaining the reasons. Instead, they simply identified them. It is important, as noted previously, that in order to gain full marks for an explain type question, candidates must either expand upon an initial point with a reason or with a justification. The reasons why some candidates performed less well in this particular question are broadly similar to those for the other explain type questions. The most common reason being that candidates do not address the explanation requirement of the question, instead tending to answer with a series of unrelated points, occasionally in the form of a bullet-pointed list. Such an approach is inappropriate for an explain question. A further frequent reason for candidates failing to achieve higher marks is that their responses are generic and not related to the context of the question. In this instance, answers which stated the process was either expensive or only used for small batches did not gain credit, as these statements do not have sufficient detail. Similarly, many candidates showed a lack of understanding of the technical reasons why the process was not suitable for producing a batch of the packaging. Often, these were inaccurate, such as noting that photographic images are impossible with screen printing. In order for candidates to achieve higher marks, their responses should be improved by providing a justification for points which they have made, with these making reference to the scenario in the question. The AS Graphics paper often has questions which ask candidates to describe how a particular process is carried out. Some of these may be commonly used in schools, whilst others may be more frequently found in industry. Question 6C requires the candidates to have knowledge of the flexography printing process and asks them to produce an annotated sketch to describe the process. In this case, as a describe question, candidates' responses require features to be identified and also some annotation to provide a basic description of the process. Historically, candidates have performed well when answering this format of question, with printing processes commonly being examined in this way. To achieve full marks for this style of question, candidates are required to produce clear sketches which indicate the key features of the printing process. In this case, this required the 4 cylinders to be shown, the ink pan identified either on the sketch or in annotations, the media passing through the plate and impression cylinders. In addition to these, marks were subsequently awarded for correct identification of the cylinders by name and the doctor blade. In this particular response, the candidate has addressed each of these points, making use of annotations to explain that the paper is fed between the impression and plate cylinders with the plate cylinder printing onto the paper. It is important that candidates have knowledge of each of the printing processes named in the specification and can produce diagrams which describe how the process is carried out. This particular response is typical of one made by a candidate who has some awareness of the process of flexography but is inaccurate and does not make effective use of annotations. In this response, the candidate has drawn the correct arrangement of rollers and has identified an ink vat, which is appropriate for 2 marks in total. No further marks are awardable, however, for the following reasons. Firstly, the substrate is shown in the wrong position. This should be between the top 2 cylinders. Secondly, the labelling of the cylinders is too vague for credit to be given for these. To gain marks, the correct names for each of the cylinders would be required, or a description of their function. The majority of candidates who were able to respond with a description of the flexography process were able to produce a sketch which was clear to mark by examiners. Whilst this response only gained 3 marks, 1 mark for the ink pan being identified, 1 mark for the 4 cylinders, and 1 mark for Analox plate, spelt incorrectly. It highlights those aspects which were generally present in the mid-achieving responses. The majority of candidates were aware that 4 cylinders are used for flexography and drew this in a stack format as shown here. Most candidates were also aware of the ink pan or ink fountain. A small proportion of candidates mistakenly identified this as a damping solution as would be found in offset lithography. This attracted no marks. The main reason why candidates did not gain full marks was the lack of annotations or descriptions of the 4 rollers. In this case, despite the incorrect spelling, credit has been given for the analog cylinder as it is in the correct place. No mark is given for cylinder plate, as the labelling is for the 4th cylinder rather than the 3rd. Where candidates did not achieve full marks for this question, it tended to be because they had omitted key aspects of the equipment used in the flexography process. Common errors included missing out one of the cylinders from the stack, or alternatively, adding additional cylinders into the diagram. Some candidates also omitted the ink pan, or placed this in the incorrect place. Also, many candidates showed a lack of understanding of how the image was transferred onto the substrate. This ranged from showing the substrate in the incorrect position as seen in the previous 2 examples, or by indicating the substrate passes between all 4 rollers. The main way in which candidates can improve their response is by making sure that their sketches are drawn larger, making full use of the space available, and they include annotations which are written concisely and clearly. Section 231A, Part 4 of the AS specification also includes a number of paper and board materials. Candidates should have an understanding of the structural composition of these paper and boards. In question 2A, the focus is on the structure of foil-lined board, with candidates being asked to describe the structure of the foil-lined board. The mark scheme explains that the marks are awarded for 3 specific features being identified. Firstly, a sketch showing at least 3 flat layers. This can be either drawn in 2D or 3D. Secondly, either on the sketch or in a written annotation, there must be reference to the liner and/or the middle ply. Candidates who referred to these as layers or boards also would get credit. Finally, for the 3rd mark, either in the annotation or through labelling, the outer foil layer and backing board should be identified for the 3rd mark. Look at the example of a candidate's response above. Using the mark scheme for question 2A, decide what mark you think should be awarded and why. You may pause the video to carry out this activity if you wish. This candidate response is particularly complex and goes beyond what would normally be expected from a candidate. It does, however, feature a good combination of sketches and annotations to describe in detail the structure of foil-lined board. On first inspection, it appears that the large sketch in the centre only shows 2 layers. However, when taken in conjunction with the smaller sketch to the top left, it can be seen that the candidate has recognised that at least 3 layers are used to produce foil-lined board. As a result, 1 mark can be awarded against the first marking point. The annotation alongside the smaller sketch indicates several plies, which can be given credit as reference to the second marking point, which credits reference to plies. The second mark is therefore awarded for this. Finally, the annotations identify the foil lining and a thick board base layer in order to gain the 3rd mark available. For this particular question, those candidates who achieved full marks did so because they were able to present their knowledge of the structure of foil-lined board clearly. They used annotations clearly and effectively in order to describe the structure of the board. They also used the correct technical terminology, such as liners and plies, although credit was still given to candidates who used alternative terms such as layers. The diagrams provided by higher achieving candidates were generally clearly presented and, similar to the example shown, were in an exploded form. Where candidates were less successful, other than through a lack of knowledge of the material in question, this was often as a result of one of the following. Firstly, candidates produced sketches which were unclear or difficult to interpret. Often, these were either very small or drawn with thick pens which made them hard to interpret. Some candidates also used light pencil sketches, which were also difficult to interpret. The main reason why candidates failed to achieve all marks was that they did not add detailed annotation to their work. Some candidates drew accurate sketches but did not identify the different layers, therefore gained no credit for these. Finally, the most common reason for candidates not gaining full marks was that they omitted key features, such as the middle plies, from their answers. A common response was to show only 2 layers, which could only achieve 1 mark. In the AS Graphics examination, candidates need to be able to demonstrate both their knowledge and understanding of the subject along with their drawing and design skills. Based on their performance on this paper, the following common issues have been identified. Candidates do not explain extensions or justifications to key points made in explain-type questions. It should be emphasized to candidates that an explain question requires a valid point and a relevant and related explanation for each valid point made. The quality of drawings does not always allow candidate responses to be interpreted easily. Poor quality sketching and weak annotations continues to be an issue, despite this being a GCE in graphics. Candidates should produce neat and well-presented sketches and drawings which make good use of the space available. They should also use the drafting skills which have been developed for internally assessed work to answer questions which involve sketching or drawing. Generic answers are often provided by weaker candidates who give responses which either have a tenuous or limited link to the scenario in the question. To avoid this, candidates should be encouraged to read questions fully so that they understand the focus of each specific question. Variable understanding of technical vocabulary and processes, including those explicitly listed in the specification. It is not good examination practice for candidates to write everything they know about the subject in a question. Rather, they should give answers which include only information which is asked for. GCSE English subjects and Maths are changing first for first teaching in September 2015, with first assessments in summer 2017. GCEs for a range of subjects are changing first for first teaching in September 2015, with first assessments in summer 2017. We have just published our specifications on the Edexcel website. They have been published early in draft form to enable teachers to have early sight of our proposed approach. We are also running a series of launch events too. Our draft specs and SAMs, as well as further information about our launch events, can be found on edexcel.com. Other GCSE and GCE subjects following in 2016 and 2017.